Hello everybody, this is going to be a video that was inspired by one of my subscribers. He sent me a screenshot of a Twitter thread and asked if I was familiar with this, and I wasn't, so I looked into it. And the Twitter thread, and I'm sure many of you maybe heard about this, is regarding Tom Woods and his ex-wife, and specifically the age disparity between the two of them. Now, of course, the age disparity between the two of them is the same number of years now or when they got divorced as when they met, but when they met, uh, she was pretty young. And so this has raised a little bit of a controversy here. Now, I want to talk about it because this is an interesting philosophical question, and it's something that I have talked about in the past. Now, what I don't want to do here is try and yay or nay, say exactly what happened, because there's a lot about the early parts of their relationship and even the later parts of their relationship that we don't know. And I also don't want it to come across as I'm just trying to defend Tom or I'm a Tom fanboy. I've obviously listened to many of his podcasts. I don't believe I've read any of his books. I've seen, obviously, I couldn't tell you how many lectures. And in general, I enjoy a lot of his stuff, but I'm not a Tom Woods fanboy. Like I said, I haven't bought any of his books. Um, I, f- I always get a strange feeling that he could a lot of the stuff he does seems kind of superficial when it doesn't need to be. Like, I feel like he does know enough to really dive deep into a lot of things, and just doesn't, and it sort of annoys me. It also could just be that, you know, he's been somebody that I've been on the scene for so long and that I've seen so much of, that it's just maybe I'm a little bit bored with him. Um, and but it's not going. This isn't going to be in the specifics of his case, because we don't know all the specifics of his case. It's going to use what we do know as an illustration, and is kind of like a philosophical exercise here. So, uh, Tom ex-wife, whose name is Heather, I believe they got divorced 2 or 3 years ago, maybe a little bit more, is somebody that he met when she was a teenager. He made, and so the Twitter, if you look at this up on Twitter, and this is confirmed by her family members and to some extent by Tom, is he met her online through somebody else. Like, he apparently knew her family somewhat. Her mother worked with or for, I'm not exactly sure, him in a magazine called Catholic Mass Magazine. I don't know if he was her boss or they just worked on the same team, and that is going to be potentially relevant for some of the philosophical discussions to be had here. Uh, and somehow he was connected to Heather in an AOL chat group by a mutual, somebody who knew Heather and someone who knew him. And when he was first talking to her, he did not know her age, it sounds like. But by the end of the first conversation, he did. Now, the nature of this first conversation seems like it was not a sexual conversation or a date. It wasn't like, they were on a dating app and they met that way. Uh, but at some point after that first discussion, and this is one of the points of fact that isn't, I haven't seen detailed, right? And everything that I've seen, I haven't seen anything where it says this is where it officially began. But at some point, it became a long distance relationship. At the time, Heather lived in Oklahoma. Tom was in New York City even, and so they're talking through chat, and they're also calling. And they did not meet until she turned 16, apparently right after she turned 16. And they met, and basically as soon as she turned 18, they got engaged, and then they got married when she was 19. And Tom has never denied that she was young. She got married when she was 19, and now the kind of the revelation is how much sooner did they meet. They basically got in contact when she was 15 and started at some point after that, and we don't know if it was the next day or the next week or the next month. We don't know if it wasn't until she was 16 or not that it became a relationship, and we also don't know what type of relationship this was exactly. And for some questions that would be pertinent, so we'll kind of go into that. So there's a good article, and it is a good article by one of the Fakeitarians called "What Your Facebook Friends Are Wrong About Tom Woods." Clever title, and you know what I will say is it seems like they back up all of the chronological claims, right? So everything that I'm saying here about when they're able to document, right? This is when they first started talking. This is when they got engaged. This is when they got married. This is how old Heather would have been. And but there's a few things they don't know. For instance, when did the conversations go from a seemingly random AOL conversation to an actual relationship? We don't know exactly when that was. It was early, but we don't know if it was the first conversation, the second, if it was in a week or a month or 6 months. Sounds like the first conversation happened right around when she was 15 and a half, maybe 5 or 6 months before she turned 16-ish. So one thing, though, that I'll point out about this article, and I recommend you guys find the article. Now, apparently it was published somewhere, and then Eric July pulled some strings to get it pulled down, but you can still find it, and it's a good article, and I don't think it should have been pulled down. And it seems clear that Tom Woods is trying to obfuscate exactly how young she was when they first made contact. Now, if not when they first met. That's not, and the fact that they're getting stuff pulled down, there's also, this seems to be this attempt to say, look, they're just trying to attack me because they're against the Mises Caucus or whatever. I doubt that's the case. I mean, I'm sure the anti-Mises Caucus people are eating this up, but, Tom isn't running for anything. And I think this is just coming up when it's coming up. Also, whether it is or is not an attack, the claims, are true or not, right? And that article, in terms of the factual chronology, I think does a pretty good. You can find Twitter threads. Heather's sister or supposed sister, but seems credible. Kind of gave her assent to the chronology. So. One of the things the article says is things like, and this is what I don't like about it. Well, they got married when she was only 19. Okay, only 19. So it's legal to get married when you're 19. It's legal to get married when you're 18. In many states, it's legal to get married even before you're 18, sometimes with parental consent, sometimes without. So there's this, well, we're going to say it's bad because we think it's too young, but it's perfectly legal. And also the kind of opprobrium that you're attaching to this, it's vaguely bad that she was 19 when they got married and 18 when they got engaged. Why is that bad? Right? She's literally an adult at that point. He's an adult. They're consenting adults. So why is that bad? Why are we passionate dispersion? And the other thing they talk about, well, when they met, when she was, quote, barely 16. So the first time they actually met, she was indeed 16. Now, we don't know what happened at that meeting. Knowing Tom Woods, they might have just had a really awkward, weird conversation. I don't know. Like, did they have a picnic? Did they go to a bowling alley? Did they talk about politics? It seems like very, very early in the discussion, Tom was asking her things about politics, how she felt about Republicans and Democrats, right? So we don't know if at this first date they did anything sexual, talked about anything sexual, but let's say for the sake of argument, and this is one thing that there's no evidence on, but let's just say for the sake of argument that they had, some really weird, awkward sex. I don't know what Heather looks like, but I know what Tom's new fiance girlfriend looks like, and I saw the two of them at Porkfest, and I immediately thought, oh, it's Tom's daughter. Tom brought his daughter to Porkfest to show her around. She wanted to see what Dad does. Oh, it wasn't his daughter. It was his new girlfriend, I guess. And, not only was she way younger than him, she's way taller and bigger. So I don't know if that's true with Heather. I don't know what Heather looks like. I don't know what her size was. But let's say that they had sex. They had, hot or weird sex, whatever you want to say. And in the article, they refer to this as underage, but that's not true. The age of consent in Oklahoma, where this happened, is 16. right? A 16-year-old in Oklahoma, and indeed in many, many states, is able to consent to have sex with. Now, sometimes some states have so-called Romeo and Juliet clauses where a 16-year-old can have sex, but only if somebody is also under 18 or under 20. They have different rules sometimes. So it's okay if you have sex with your 17-year-old boyfriend, but not with your 35-year-old boyfriend, for instance. Now, at the time, I think Tom would have been 26 or 27. They were 26 when they first started talking. By the time they had their first meeting, I don't know if he was still 26 or if he was 27. They got married when he was 29 and she was 19. He's 11 years older than her, uh, more or less. So, when you say she's underage, not legally, not, at least not in Oklahoma where this happened. Now, this also kind of brings up a meta point that people have these very strong reactions to this, and I understand it. People look at it like we want to protect children, we want to protect kids, and anything that puts them at danger is just anathema, and people see it as a black and white issue. And I heard, uh, Michael Malice did a pretty good thing with his interview with Thaddeus Russell, where age of consent is not a black and white issue. Picking where the date should be is not yes or no. You have to pick, and the thing is, it's different not only between different countries. I mean, there's countries where the age of consent is 14, where it's 15, where it's 16, where it's 17, where it's 18. I don't know if there are many that go higher than that. There could well be. In fact, many people in this discussion will marshal arguments along the lines of your brain's not fully developed until you're 25. Okay, so are they then arguing that the age of consent should be 25? It sounds like that's the logical implication of what's being said. I haven't actually heard anybody actually say that, but it seems logical based on the argument that would be given in that case. But even within the United States, age of consent again varies from 16, 17, 18, sometimes even a little bit less. There's some states where you can get married when you're 15, I think, with parental consent. A weird case here in New Hampshire, age of consent is 16 for heterosexuals, but 18 for homosexuals. Right? Is someone going to tell me, so which one is the obviously correct one? Should it be 18 or should it be 16 or should it be 17? Right? And there's kind of a problem. There's several problems here. One is like you have something that in one state is perfectly legal, and then if you literally cross the border, which in some cases means crossing the street or a river very often, now suddenly you're a sex offender. You're a felon. You committed statutory rape. The other problem is this desire to protect. It's totally understandable, and it's reasonable to have protection for people who can't consent, who don't know what's best for them or can't make a decision like that. That's absolutely a good thing to do. But it also imposes costs, because if you start imposing that on people who can make a decision, so use an analogy, an analogy here. We do the same thing. We minors basically don't have the same numbers of rights. They have some rights, like you can't kill a minor or whatnot, but like they can be compelled to go to school. They can be prevented from going to work. They can be basically they're wards of the state or of their parents. They don't have the right to sign contracts. They don't have the right to own property. They don't have the right to have sex or to date certain people. And the same is true for people who are adjudicated like mentally retarded or being insane. And so you'll take somebody who's a full adult, right? And a good example here would be Deidre McCloskey, who a wonderful economist who transitioned to be a woman. When she transitioned to be a woman, I think in her 50s, her family got her institutionalized. They basically went to the court and said she's crazy. She gets snatched up. She loses her freedom, right? She is placed in a mental institution, essentially a prison. Literally a prison, deprived of her liberty, and she has to somehow convince the staff that she's not crazy. And they've done experiments on this where they put people in these that are definitely not crazy, and the staff will still treat them crazy and say that they are crazy, right? Because so many of the metrics that determined insanity are subjective and up to the whim of the practitioner, that they can basically make anyone crazy. And so McCloskey loses all of her freedoms, all of her rights. Eventually she escapes, right? Eventually she's able to make it out of there, and thank God. She wrote some wonderful, wonderful books. She seems like a charming and amazing trans woman. But the problem is you could just say, well, we're being protective. We don't want somebody who is insane to be free, right? Because they could hurt themselves or others. So this is for their own. But if you're doing that to people who are not crazy, who are not insane, who are have the sufficient cognitive and physical abilities to be autonomous, then you're violating their rights, and it's actually quite egregious. And so this idea also applies when you're talking about age of consent. You don't want people who are incapable of consenting to be harmed. On the other hand, you don't want to take people who are capable of consenting and put basically imprisoning them. And like we do this to kids because we take people who are functionally adults, like physically adults and mentally adults, and say you don't have any rights. You have to go to school. You have to do whatever your parents say. You can't sign a contract. You can't get a driver's license. You can't even date the people that you want to date. So people want to be defensive, and I get that. People want to say that we want to protect people who need to be protected. Fair enough, but you need to. There should be an honest effort, a real honest, hard look at what should and what should not. What should the age of consent be? If that's even the correct way to look at it. It might be the only way practically to look at it. I'm not sure it's actually the best way, but there's a lot of innuendo here that like, well, she was underage. Well, if she was 16, they could have had sex. They could have had the most raunchy sex ever, and it would have been perfectly legal in Oklahoma, and indeed in many states. And if these people, if you're somebody who does not like that or hates that, then you should consider a legislative revolution where we raise the age of consent in every state to whatever you think it should be, right? And realizing, of course, what that would do is criminalize a huge number of voluntary acts that are currently happening. Now, if you think that those voluntary acts aren't really voluntary because 17-year-olds couldn't possibly consent to sex, then, make the argument. It could be a philosophically consistent one, but right now we have quite a mismatch and a hodgepodge. Now, if we're talking about before she was 16, there we don't have as many details, right? Legally, if she was sending him nudes, for instance, if she was, and even after she was 16, if she was taking nudes on her AOL chat window and sending them to Tom Woods, then she's guilty of child porn and he's guilty of child porn. And this is true even after she's 16. It's true when she's 17. That's true until she's 18, right? And so if that was happening, he's guilty of that. She's guilty of that too. No, there's no allegation that was happening. I don't know how likely that would have been in 99 and 2000, given the state of digital technology. That could have happened. I don't know. It wasn't alleged anywhere. Now, assuming that isn't what happened, it could have. No one's alleging that it had. Even Tom's worst critics, nobody's come. And it seems kind of unlikely. Catholic girl, oldest daughter of what, 13 or 11 kids, I forget. Is talking with this Catholic luminary. I guess it could happen, but their discussions, if they were talking about things sexual, if they were talking about maybe kids or marriage or, there are laws about contributing to the delinquency of a minor. That's another thing. If they went on a picnic together and he fucked her brains out, but then gave her a glass of wine after, the fucking her brains out part is legal. The fact that he gave her a glass of wine after is not, right? So, because she's not legally allowed to drink wine, and so he's contributing to the delinquency of a minor. So think about that for a minute. And actually, I'll use the alcohol has some other interesting analogies here too. But a lot of these laws, though, are extremely vague. And they're so vague that I actually know a lot of people who absolutely categorically refuse to interact with anybody under 18, right? Under anything other than you go to McDonald's and they're your cashier, but that's it, right? Because these laws are so vague that it's possible, even if you never do anything, even nothing sexual has happened, nothing sexual is discussed, a prosecutor who decided they didn't like you could go after you for that kind of stuff. And I've seen this happen. I was in a Facebook group a couple years ago where there was a member who actually it turned out was fake. We don't really know who they really were, but everything about their profile was fake. But we didn't know this at the time. Whoever it was said that they were 17, and a lot of people in the group said you can't be in this group, and because we can't have a 17-year-old in a group, because there's casual discussions, and sometimes those discussions are sexual. Again, nobody was trying to recruit anybody, and there's nothing like that happening, but it's just too legally risky. Now, in that case, since the person was faking who they were, we don't have any idea how old they actually were or who they even were. But again, we don't know. The fact that they were talking at all doesn't prove what they were talking about, and there is no crime to talk to a 15-year-old, right? You can talk with a 15-year-old, and it's interesting because the argument against, and this is where, if you look at, why should a minor, a person who truly can't consent, not children, like say you have two kids, let's say they're both 8, and they do stuff together. They do sexual stuff together. It happens, all right? You could say, well, they're both minors, not a problem. The problem arises when you have somebody who's an adult, right? Somebody who's bigger, stronger, has more of their mental faculties. They could do something sexual. And the younger party, the smaller, less developed party, would be in a very difficult position, and it would be very hard for them to consent in any meaningful way, because the power dynamic would be just so skewed. It's similar to the idea of, like, if you have a boss who owns the company, who can fire you, who can give you raises, who can do everything. Can you really consent if they make a play on you? And the thing is, when you're talking about a child and an adult, I'd say the power dynamic is even way more skewed than just, somebody's your boss, right? Even if it's a very powerful boss. So even if you have a kid, and I've talked to a lot of gay guys who, when they were younger, report having interactions with either peers or people who were older than their peers. Very usually a family member, usually an uncle or a stepbrother or a half brother or a cousin, things like that. And sometimes they'll say, "Oh, I enjoyed it. It was a good thing for me," but sometimes it wasn't. And the thing is, with the power imbalance, you just don't know ex ante or a priority. So it's really potentially so harmful that it should not be allowed. And that starts to change when the physical and cognitive abilities of the person change. So when you start to go through puberty, not the first day that your pituitary gland starts to secrete hormones, but your development starts to skyrocket. Right? You physically become bigger, you physically become stronger, and your mental abilities also skyrocket. Now, again, that doesn't mean that the first day that you begin puberty that you're able to consent, but it means that you get closer and closer. And also, I think that thinking about this issue, there's something very arbitrary about the idea that one day you're a complete child and can't possibly do anything, and then you have a birthday, you blow out the candles, and now you can do anything. Because your development did not shoot up and plateau on the night that you turn 17 or 18 or 15. It starts to go up. I mean, you're going up at a certain rate as a small child, right? You're getting bigger, but you're just becoming a bigger child. You're not physically mature. You can't have children. What puberty essentially does is it makes you into adult. What puberty does is it makes you able to have and rear children, right? There's no point, evolutionary speaking, of having you become able to have children but unable to protect those children, right? If you were able to get pregnant or get somebody pregnant but would be so inept that you couldn't possibly survive to the birth, or bring the baby to term, or to support it once it was born, then that wouldn't make any sense, right? Evolutionarily speaking. So it seems like, at least biologically, and we can talk about the difference between cultures and biology, but biologically, once you can have kids, it's at least scientifically plausible that you can consent to sex, right? Um, Now, when that happens and here's the problem with age, it correlates some, but not perfectly, and there's a bell curve, right? So puberty starts at slightly different ages for different people, and it proceeds at different rates. And so if you look at ages, if you look at 18-year-olds, pretty much all 18-year-olds are going to be done with puberty unless they had some kind of serious issue or they're very, very late bloomers, right? So these people are going to be childbearing in terms of their physiology. 17-year-olds, the vast majority of them, same, but there's going to be a smaller subset, bigger than the 18-year-olds who can't. And you go down the line. And when you start to get to, and here's the thing, like the big inflection point isn't at 17 or 18 or 16. It's more like probably 14 or 13, right? So if you go like 12-year-olds, very rare that a 12-year-old is going to be able to have kids. Some, you do a cohort, you're going to have a bell curve. You go to 13-year-olds, it's going to be a mix. You go to 14-year-olds, a lot of them are going to be able to do it. Now, you could argue, and it makes sense, well, just biologically being able to have kids doesn't prove that you have the mental wherewithal to consent. I would argue that evolutionarily speaking, that seems questionable, right? Again, there would be it would be a disadvantage evolutionarily speaking if you were able to have conceived children but not able to rear them, because then you're imposing all these massive costs on yourself that won't have any benefit. But fair point. And I wouldn't just say it's as simple as, well, let's just say if you can have kids that you can consent, right? There's people who have all the plumbing, right, but are just mentally not there. But again, this is not just true of teenagers. There's plenty of people in their 20s and 30s who are just not there, right? There's plenty of people who can't consent reasonably even when they're 35 or 45 because they don't have the mental faculties for it, even if they could reproduce physically. So I think that it makes sense to have metrics tests. What is your cognitive ability? Are you able to understand the ramifications of sex? Are you understand the ramifications of signing a contract? Are you understand the risks involved of whether it be STDs or pregnancies? Do you understand all those things? And I'm not saying, and I wouldn't advocate that we have a set of tests that are easier for teenagers or that are made more likely for them to pass. I think it would make sense to have the same test across for everybody. Think about this like a driver's license. I don't think that there should be an easier set of driving, if you're going to have a driver's license, which you are going to have whether you have anarchy or not. This is the whole other thing is we can look at the different types. But the test should be the same for everybody, right? There shouldn't be oh, well, you're 18, you take one test, you're 15, you take a different test. You determine whether they can drive safely or not. If they can't drive safely, you don't give them a driver's license. If they can, you do. And if it so happens that some of the people who can are 14, well, they passed the test. So what exactly would be the problem, right? And there seems to be this cultural feeling that you can't possibly do that, which is sometimes, it's not always ironic, but it's ironic whenever you have people say, the teenagers don't have enough responsibility, they're immature, they're coddled, but by the way, we can possibly allow them to drive a car, sign a contract, or date somebody, right? So part of the problem with adolescents is that they are physically adults or very, very close to adults. They're mentally very, very close to adults. This idea that your brain development continues until 25. Your brain development continues your whole life. In fact, your brain starts to shrink. The biggest that your brain gets is when you're a teenager, and it starts to shrink after that. Like an 80-year-old or a 90-year-old, their brain is like half the size in terms of like how much of it is working. Like your absolute quickest. Now, you don't have as much experience. That's absolutely true. But that's a catch-22. You start to say you can never have experience then, right? You shouldn't be allowed to date because you don't have experience dating, okay? And then when they turn 18, like, well, you still don't have any experience, so you still shouldn't be able, right? Keep going and going and going, never ends. So it's, I mean, if I were to have my druthers, it wouldn't be based on age of consent. It would be based on competency. And it wouldn't matter if you were 20 or 25. If you couldn't pass the competency, then you can't consent. Not to a job, not you're going to basically be institutionalized or held in trust by somebody else, probably a family member, maybe an institution, right, an orphanage or something. And if you can, you're free and you have the autonomy to make those decisions. It does make sense to me that there's going to be a graduation. So like you can consent to some things before others. And I don't know, dating and sex probably isn't the first thing, and it's also probably not the last thing either. So, and it's going to be different for different people. There's going to be some people who, when they're 15, are mature enough to consent to sex. I mean, you can say that's impossible, or you don't like that idea, or you find it creepy. That's your personal choice. But people have all kinds of different, personal choices. But if you say, look, these are the tests, they're not easier for younger people. We give the same tests, and if they can pass them, who are we? What's the argument? I mean, the argument, like when you go to a roller coaster and they say you got to be a certain height because that's the only way to safely sit in the machine, and then somebody says, well, he's pretty young, but he's tall enough. It's like, but then he fits in the machine. It's not a problem, right? It's not safe. It's not unsafe because his body type puts him in that position. So, was this the case with Heather? I don't know. I wasn't there. Like, Tom always says she was really mature. I don't know. We only have his word on it. And again, Tom, that marriage, they got married, they had 5 kids, and then it ended disastrously. We don't know exactly why. She said that they had to move apart, quote, for everybody's safety, whatever the fuck that means. So, again, I don't want to, say Tom Woods is a great guy or defend everything that he's ever done. His marriage completely failed, and he was, very soon after that, cavorting out with another much younger woman. And I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me if that was the problem. His wife just wasn't, a kid anymore, so he wasn't into her. I don't know if that was it. We don't have the details. I don't particularly want to know the details. But none of that is to say whether or not Heather, as a 15-year-old, was, mature enough to. And again, we don't know how the conversation started. I have a lot of people right now that I'm not dating and I'm not doing anything sexual with, but who I'm talking with, right? Who I know because I see them in my daily life. There's a lot of people in my gym that I talk to. There's a lot of people that through work or in my neighborhood, and I know people, right? And it's not sexual, but let's say in a year or 2 years, it became sexual with some of these people. Okay. Somebody could look and well, okay, but the first time you started talking to them was a couple years ago, so they were a minor then. Okay, but the conversations were not sexual, so what's the problem, right? So there's kind of this, there's one detail, and I'm going to acknowledge it, but she says that their first date was a phone call. But we don't know exactly how old she was when that phone call happened. And also, a date, I've had dates where sex was never discussed and never culminated or even alluded to. And I've had dates that ended in hot, amazing sex. So and obviously a phone date did not end in hot, amazing sex. They could have discussed sex. And again, if she had not been 16 at the time of that phone call, and that's what they talked about, then they may have run afoul of some of these vague laws. If they didn't talk about it, it's not clear that they did at all. So I understand the desire to protect people, but there is such a thing. There's a cost for overprotection, and it's not a minor cost. It's not just, oh, well, it's the cost is the creepy old men who want to date younger people. That's, they could go to jail, right? Because there's differences in the laws. You have this thing where you could be, look, in New Hampshire, if I fucking went and hooked up with a 16-year-old girl, it would be legal. If I hook up with a 16-year-old boy, it's against the law, right? Okay. Place in the comments if you think that's justified, right? If that makes any fucking sense. But the same thing, crossing state lines, very often you'll see a jump from 16 to 17 or sometimes even 18, and again, these laws the absurdity comes, and look, when I was in high school, I wasn't sexually active at all in high school, by the way. I didn't do anything with anybody. But, When I was a freshman, the one and only time I ever like dated somebody, I dated a girl, and she was a senior, and I was a freshman. Right? We met in August at marching band camp, and I was 15 at that time, and she was 18, and we dated. I would go and hang out at her place, and we go to movies, and we watch movies, and I met her family. Still friends with her family, actually. And you know, I was obviously gay, so like I wasn't exactly gunning for fun. I think she was, but she didn't push it too hard. I don't know if it's because she was a girl. I don't know. But we went to prom together, and I kissed her. She insisted, and I did. And like, was she statch raping me? That happened, right? Now, by that point, I would have been 16. I don't know what the age of consent in Michigan was at the time, but I would have been 16 by then, and she would have been 18. Uh, but we were 15 when we first started dating, and it's like, did she statch rape me? And similar, there were a couple cases of like high school couples that I knew. Like I'm thinking about one. They dated all through high school. They took a little break after high school, and then got back together at some point in college. They got married, and they've got like 6 kids at this point. They've been married 20 years. There was another couple that were just kind of randomly dating, and the guy was younger. The guy was 16. The girl was 17, and she got pregnant. And they have 3 kids now. They're married. Obviously he's probably 30. He's probably 37 yeah, he's probably 37, and his son is 21, his oldest son. They've got, 2 other kids after that. Or another case, there was a girl. She, well, I won't give any more details, but she was a senior. She was on the tennis team, and they had a new coach who was the new tennis coach. And I remember there were a lot of rumors that they seemed close, but nobody ever caught them in the act. There was never any scandal or anything. But sure enough, as soon as she graduated, they started to date, and they got married, and they're still married, and they have 3 kids at this point. They have a very successful family. He would have probably been 21 or 22, and she probably would have been 17 or 18, right? And okay, if you don't like that, that's fine. And a lot of people use the word creepy, and that creepy is a word. It definitely has a place, but there's some problems with it. There's a lot of things that people call creepy are personal and subjective. For instance, like in the gay community, right? If you're at a club or something, and a guy who you're not attracted to comes and like flirts with you, or gives you a look, or indicates a sexual interest in you, right? If a guy that you find unattractive, typically maybe like a really much older man, right? Say you're 25, and a guy who's 70 flirts with you, you go, oh, that's creepy. But then somebody else that you are attracted to does exactly the same thing, right? Like literally the same words, the same mannerisms, the same looks, and then you suddenly say that's hot. Okay, you're allowed to not be attracted to somebody. I'm not certainly not one of those to say that you're obligated to have reciprocal sexual interest in somebody. I don't agree with that at all. But there's something that's a little bit unfair to say, if 2 people do something, the one that you're attracted to is not creepy, but the one that you are not is, right? And so I can fully appreciate if you are personally only interested in people the same age as you, right? And you look at it like, I find that gross because there's an 11-year difference there. But there are people who don't feel that way, all right? There are people who are attracted to much older people. As a gay guy, there's a lot of quote-unquote people who love daddies. There's a lot of guys, even older guys, who love daddies, right? There's people in their 30s and 40s who want somebody who's in their 50s or 60s. But I mean, one of the guys I dated, he was in college. He was 18. Like, he moved away after he graduated, and so he's probably 21 right now. His boyfriend is 55, and he absolutely is just. And I don't get it, right? I'm not interested in 55-year-old guys, right? So, but if he was only into college guys, and that same 55-year-old guy, like, messaged him, he'd be like, you're a creep, right? And as far as I know, I'm not as familiar with like females. Correct me in the comments here, but I wouldn't be surprised if there were females who felt the same way. And like there seems to be actually quite a long history of this. Like if you're female and you get involved with somebody your own age and you're both young, let's say you get married when you're 18 or 19 or 20 or 22, 23, there's a good chance that your partner is, financially not in the best spot. He could still be a student, right? Like, not that many guys in their late teens, early 20s have their shit together or have a lot of status or a lot of income. And so, you're going to not have it. That's going to cause certain issues. Now, if you're much more attracted to guys your own age and you connect with them emotionally better, absolutely fine, right? That's fine. But if you think, hey, there's something about an older man that I like, you can decide that's not for you. That's totally fine. But to say I don't like it when other people do it, again, just being gay, right? Like, there's plenty of people who are going to be like, ew, that is gross. I don't want to suck a dick. I don't want to do anything with a butt. Like, I don't want to kiss a guy with a beard. That's disgusting. Okay, fine. You don't have to do it. But, like, if you're not going to call it something objectively wrong, okay, maybe, but you got to have more of an argument there, right? Like, if you're going to say this is actually wrong, if you're going to say this is an ethical problem, then you need to say more than it's creepy to you, right? And I agree that if you have a situation where somebody is young enough that they can't consent, that they don't understand what's happening, that they can be too easily manipulated, that they can be too easily intimidated physically or mentally or whatever, then yes, that is creepy. And, sad to say, I mean, where this happens the most is within families, right? You have older, typically men, sometimes women. I mean, I had a good friend in my whole life. Like, I knew from kindergarten all the way through high school and college. Very, very close with this guy and his brother. He had two brothers. We had two pairs of brothers that were there, actually three pairs of brothers who were all the same age. And he messaged me out of the blue maybe a year ago, and said that his mom, who I knew his mom very well, she's like that she sexually abused him constantly. Uh, Now, I don't know. I never witnessed this. I don't know if it's true, but I don't know why he would lie about that. He wasn't asking for anything. He was just opening up about the past. He opened up about a few other things too. Okay, so like, it's not only men, but it's mostly men. I'd say, so like, mostly an older male relative, like taking advantage, or an authority figure. And this is where we can bring this back to Tom a little bit. It is possible for an authority figure, right, a boss or a teacher. And here's the thing, like, teachers do this all the time, like, relatively speaking. People talk about the Catholic Church. It's a problem there. It's a problem with any church, right? You have this religious figure that has some kind of enhanced authority vis-a-vis the deity, potentially, if you go there and believe in it. Then that could give them some license. But teachers have legal, like, you're forced to go there. And that happens all the time, right? All these people like Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens, who are all up on the Catholic Church is clearly evil because they have sex scandals. Public schools have sex scandals all the time. And it was funny, it wasn't Hitchens, it was, what's his name? Who wrote the Selfish Gene? Forget his name. But he talked about, he many, many times where he would be like, Catholic Church is evil, look at this. And then it got brought out because he went to one of these British boarding schools where pederasty is just rampant. And he acknowledged it and was like, yeah, but that's just part of growing up. It's like normal. So like, okay, so if the Catholic Church does it, it just proves that they are the most terrible organization ever. But if your school does it, it's like, yeah, it's just, you take your hits. It's fine. It's part of growing up, right? Right. I've never heard Sam Harris talk about the problems with schools, right? And when we talk about this, first of all, I don't know if any of you have ever met Tom Woods or seen Tom Woods. He's not exactly physically intimidating. He's a small guy. He doesn't work out. He's not in shape. He's a small guy. And if you look at the women that he seems to be into, like his current girlfriend, She's bigger than him. I mean, I'm not saying she's a big girl and he's a little guy, so the ratios. No, she's physically bigger than him. She's taller. She weighs more. She's probably stronger than him too. Like she could probably crush him, which might be what he's into. I don't know. Like it seems now. I don't know what Heather looks like. I've never seen a picture of her or a video of her, so I don't know if she's similarly. The scale is the same, but the idea that Tom is physically intimidating these women seems unlikely. The other thing too, when they first were talking, when she was 15, and then a long distance relationship after that, the physical intimidation seems very unlikely when they're not actually together, right? Like it's on the phone. I mean, somebody can pump their chest on the phone as much as they want. It doesn't, really, it's not really that intimidating. The one little wrinkle here is the work relationship that he had with her parents, her mom apparently. If it was the case, and I don't know that it was, but maybe that her mom was financially dependent on that work she did for Latin Catholic Mass magazine or Latin Mass magazine, and Tom had the ability to fire her. I don't know that he did, but maybe. It is possible that he could have, explicitly threatened Heather and said, you better, phone date me or else I'll get your mom fired from Latin Mass magazine, or even, imply that without actually doing it. And in which case, he's coercing her then. Sure. Never seen that alleged anywhere, right? So that's hypothetically possible, but I'm not even sure it's hypothetically possible in this case. I would imagine that the people writing for Latin Mass magazine, that wasn't where they were making most of their money. It doesn't sound like a regular job, and I'm not sure that Tom even had the wherewithal. This can happen. Look, I again, gay guy I knew, had, he was telling me about his financial difficulties. He had lost one of his jobs, and he had just applied for a new job as a waiter at a restaurant. And the guy who ran the interview, the manager who ran the interview, was clearly gay and was clearly into him. And the guy running the interview after the interview was over was like, what are you going to do now? Like, do you have any plans? Do you want to hang out? And he felt like if he wanted the job that he should indulge this guy. And so they hooked up. Okay. So like that is very questionable, in that circumstance. Was that the circumstance with Tom and Heather? Nobody's presented any evidence that it is. Could be. But it's interesting too because if that's what we're worried about, the amount of authority that Tom had over Heather is nothing compared to the amount of authority that like a school teacher or a pastor has over a student, right? And no one runs around saying, well, we can't possibly allow that. That could be abused. And of course, if a teacher does get caught with that, nothing ever happens. They don't call the police. The union defends them. It gets covered up. It's not a big deal, right? So, if you don't like it, that's fine, and you could even say why. But if you can't articulate a real strong ethical reason, so like, was Heather able to have a consensual long distance relationship with Tom Woods when she was 15? I don't know Heather personally. Tom can say she was mature all he wants. Obviously, he's a biased observer, so I wouldn't take that. But is it possible for a 15-year-old to be that way? I think the answer is that, yeah, a lot of them are. Not all of them. Some of them would not be capable of that. Some of them would. Was Heather? I don't know. But the idea that it's absolutely categorically impossible, I think just kind of strains credulity. And again, in the state that he was living in, so like, according to the law there, the day before she turned 16, she couldn't. The day that she turned 16, she could. That's ridiculous. I mean, I would hope everybody could understand that that's absurd. Now, in terms of like a legal framework, it may be the most workable option. All this stuff about graduation, and I think of it as a path to autonomy or a path to emancipation, right? And I think it would be gradual. This is ideally speaking. You don't say, here's one test, and if you pass this test, you're an adult. It's more like, do you want to get a driver's license? Okay, but you have to pass the same driver's license test as everybody else. And if you can drive. Doesn't mean that anything else beyond that. But then you apply for a job, and the job is going to be like, look, you're a little bit young. we've got a test that we administer to see if you're responsible enough for this job. Actually, talking to some of the guys at my gym, a lot of them work at a Whole Foods, and they apparently all take a test. When they go to Whole Foods, they take a test, and then it sounds like, I haven't taken the test myself and I don't plan to, but it sounds like, are you mature? Like, how would you react to these situations? And some of the guys, these guys they're pretty much all 17-year-olds, I think. Some of them are passing the test and some of them weren't. And the ones who weren't, they were being told, please call us again in a year. And the ones who passed it, they got jobs there, right? And they work there. So, like, you could see that happening. Another big one to draw on HOPA, insurance companies, right? So you could get a driver's license, let's say, but an insurance company is going to say, hey, we're not going to insure you unless, we're reasonably sure that this is something that you can handle and are not just foreordained to crash, right? And so they would have a very strong incentive, but they want your business too. So they're not just going to say, we're going to prescribe everybody until they're 35, right? Which is when you start to not crash as much. So you're going to pay a higher rate or whatever, but they're going to have a test. And so you're going to have somebody who's like, maybe when they're 13, they get a driver's license. Maybe when they're 14, they get insured. Maybe when they're 14, they find a place that gives them a job. Maybe they administer a test, or maybe they just roll a dice and say, hey, we'll take a chance because you're just going to be washing dishes anyway or whatever, right? And, by the time they're 15, they could have a cluster of things. And it's like, okay, this person seems to have their shit together enough, right? They can hold down a job. They can, so maybe we should talk about their autonomy. On the other hand, you could have people who, they can't get their driver's license. They couldn't pass any tests. And then it's like, okay, maybe this person can't, and now if you think that that's maybe an unworkable solution, fair enough. Maybe it's too complicated. The government couldn't do it. Maybe in anarcho-capitalism we could, but with the government we can't. And the only, rough and ready way to do it is to just have an age of consent. I don't think that's true, but it's a fair argument. But then we have to have a real solid discussion about what that should be. Because right now we don't. I mean, I know that I'm going to get a lot of hate for this. I know for sure, of all the positions that I have, of all the things that I've ever talked about, this is going to be the most controversial. It's always is. People have this incredibly strong reaction. It makes abortion look like a discussion about like tax policy, for imports or something. Like it's so much hotter than any of those other things. But the truth is that there's great variance across the laws as it is, right? So we clearly, unless you have the assumption that the law as it exists is perfect and can't be changed at all, which which logically makes no sense when there's different ages of consent across the country, then you have to acknowledge that maybe there's a room for it to change, to improve. And you can't just take I want to be as protective as possible, because you start to impose costs on that as well. And also I think it ignores the physiology here. Like it's not going to be 18. That's way too late. It's not going to be 17. That's too late. 16, I think I think that is a little late, but it's closer to the mark. I think that with 15, I think most 15-year-olds probably can. Could Heather Woods, I don't know if that's her name now, but Heather, I don't know. Very possible though. But it's also interesting too. A lot of these fakertarians, and I'm not familiar with their work, and as far as they went as like pointing out the facts of Tom's relationship, it was fine. But one of the interesting things is they talk. Tom apparently cautioned one of them against drinking, right? What's fascinating about that is, if you're in the United States and you do drink, the chances that you did not drink until you're 21 are basically zero, right? Everybody who drinks in the United States started drinking before they were legally allowed to. And that also probably means at some point somebody was providing them alcohol before they were 21, excuse me. So, these guys would be like, Tom's a creep, Tom's gross, Tom's talking to a 15-year-old. But by the way, though, they were probably getting drunk when they were in high school. And some adult, whether it was a relative or a friend or the brother of another student who graduated a couple years ago, was probably giving them alcohol. And alcohol is poison, dude. Alcohol is is bad for you. It's bad for your development as a child. You read any book about the development of the teenage brain. It's even bad for adults, but it ruins your sleep. You don't get NREM sleep. I don't even think you get REM sleep. Like, it's literally toxic, and it's really bad when you're having brain development, especially when you're a teenager. And yet, uh, this idea that, like, well, if he's talking to him, I mean, it's having sex, which they did not have sex when they were 15. They didn't even meet until she was 16. But like, having sex is not as bad for your body. It's not even, there are risks when you have sex. It can cause a problem, but it can also be perfectly safe. Like, perfectly safe and totally natural. I mean, right? Alcohol is not totally natural. Alcohol is not perfectly safe. You could have a catastrophic problem. You can have alcohol poisoning or get in an accident, and that happens a lot. It's a very high cause of death, especially for teens. But even if none of the catastrophic things happen, you're poisoning yourself. And I think you should be free to, like, I'm not saying we should ban alcohol. I'm not for prohibition. But this idea that, like, and you're, as a teen, if you were drinking when you were a teen, and again, if you drink at all, you probably drank as a teen. I would imagine many of these fakertarians who are kind of boasting about how much they drink, some of them. I mean, one of the guys who attacked Tom in Twitter, and again, most of the attack was fair in the point of, like, he's pointing out when this actually happened. But the judginess is kind of weird because, like, well, but I can drink, like, and I can drink as a teen, and an adult can provide me alcohol as a teen, and that's fine. And yet, no, that's actually contributing to the delinquency of a minor, and drinking is way worse for you than a phone conversation, for Christ's sakes. It's way worse for you than even having sex, which is not, necessarily bad if it's consensual. You say, well, they can't consent to have sex, but they can consent to get drunk, right? Come on. And I pointed out that that's a value judgment. It's very, very subjective, and it's very, very personal. And so the high and mighty, you're a creep. The other word that they used awful a lot was groomer. Now, if she's 16 and they're having sex, I don't know how you can be a groomer because it's legal. Now, the stuff that happened before, when she was 15 and they were talking, although they didn't meet, we don't know what they talked about. Now, if we were just going to say any conversation at all is grooming, like, I find that this talk of grooming doesn't make a lot of sense for people this old. If you have somebody who's on the cusp of being able to, even in the laws that we have today, which I think are not ideal, even in the laws we have today, if somebody who's weeks or months away from turning 16 or 17 or 18, the idea that, like, you can't, I mean, and it's such a vague thing. It's like these contributing to the delinquency of a minor. It's so vague, right? I do get it if you have, like, a T-ball coach who is taking the 8-year-olds on picnics, and I mean, again, from my vast, so I'm talking about an adult here. I'm talking a guy who's in his mid-20s. He's a nurse, and he has told this story to me a couple times. But he was definitely groomed by his babysitter when he was a kid. Like, when he was 8 and 9, he had a babysitter who looked after him when his parents were at work. And this guy started to very gradually introduce things. Let's go to the pool. He said he would get him to, like, try on underwear here, try and do these different pairs of underwear. And at first it was, you go change in your room, and then it got to be, well, just change right in front of me. And I mean, this progressed. And so by the time he was 11, there was a lot of physicality happening. All right. That's grooming. That's grooming. He was a little boy. He hadn't gone through puberty. He was extremely malleable. This is a person who had an awful lot of authority over him. A lot physically, absolutely over, like, could dominate. Now, in my friend's mind, he says now, and I don't know how much of this is psychological coping, right? I can't parse that out, but some of it very well could be. He says, I liked it, blah, blah, blah. But it doesn't matter. This guy was clearly taking advantage, and he was in no position to really resist. And I've heard other stories like that, right, from other people who wouldn't have really any reason to lie to me about it. Not that they couldn't, but that's grooming. Talking to somebody who's already physically mature and maybe very well mentally mature enough and that you have no power over, which I don't think that Tom did. We can again quibble about the whole Latin Mass magazine, situation. Um, like calling that grooming, I think is again, it's like calling something creepy, right? I just don't like, and even these guys were acknowledging like, oh, I don't care that it's 11 years. It's just that it's 11 years when she's 15, but it's 11 years when it's okay. And again, it draws attention to some of the absurdity of the law. So like some of these couples that I've mentioned, you know, there were the one couple in particular. They were in the same grade, but they weren't exactly the same age. Like they did not have the same birthday, and they did it all through high school, and they eventually got married, and they have I think 6 kids at this point. They're still married. They've been married like 25 years or something at this point. But there was a point where one of them turned 18 or one of them turned 16 or one of them turned 17 and the other one was still the previous year, right? One of them was 16 and one of them was 15 at one point. One of them was 17 while one of them was 16 at one point, right? And so it's like, oh, this is fine. No, it's not. That he's a rapist. He's a groomer. And I don't know which, in that case, I don't know if it was the girl or their boy who was older. It wouldn't actually matter. And so, well, that's just, people are going to say, okay, but they're within a year. Okay, so what if it was 2 years? What if instead of both being I think they graduated in 2003, instead of being the class of 2003, one of them was a class of 2003 and one was a class of 2004. Okay, is that now it's evil, right? Now it's grooming, now it's predatory. I think most people would say no. Okay, well, what if it's 2003 and 2005? Which, by the way, I knew several people in those classes who dated each other. There was a girl in my class, 2002, who dated a guy who graduated 2004, right? So it was 2 years younger. And, okay. And that's one that just pops into my head. So what the question isn't like the range I don't think matters so much as can either one of them consent or not. If they can't consent, it doesn't matter how old they are, right? If you cannot consent and you're 17 and your boyfriend is, just and he's the same age, but you can't consent, it's not okay, right? If he's only a year older or a year younger, but he can't consent, it's not okay. But if you both can consent, right? If you both have the mental and physical ability to consent, then it doesn't matter if he's 10 years older or she's 10 years older for that matter. And that happens too. So, I mean, another story for me, like when my freshman year in college, so obviously I think I'm 19 when this is happening. The first semester I was there, I had a teacher who was like, I don't know how old she was. She was in her 60s, pushing 70, very old, very frail. She was a very frail, small little woman. And she, at the time, I just thought, oh, she's a good teacher. And she would always compliment all of my writing. And at the end of the semester, she said, hey, I have a tradition. I always take one student out to dinner. And I'm like, oh, that's cool. I guess that's what you do in college. So I went out to dinner with her. She took me to a nice restaurant, paid for everything. Which was, when you live in a dorm and it's like nice, right? And then I think we did it a couple more times when I wasn't her student anymore. And then I wasn't in her class, and so it didn't really go anywhere. And then when I wanted to graduate, I wanted to go say goodbye to her. And then I started thinking about it, like, fucking, was she coming on to me? Like, was she plying me with food and tried to try? I don't drink, so that didn't work. But and the thing is, she was my professor. Like, she controlled my grade. So I think yeah, she probably was. And she was if I was 19 and she was 65, I mean, you do the math, she's triple my age, right? But I could consent at that point. So okay, you think it's weird? That's fine. I think it's weird. It's fine. But is it ethically wrong? Nah, I'd have to say probably not. The part where she's a teacher, it is, but just the age itself, no. And if we're talking about with Tom, could Heather consent as a 15-year-old? Don't know for sure, but it's totally possible. It seems like it would. I would say the odds are that she could. Don't know that for sure. Everyone's a little different. Tom, of course, is going to say that she could. He's got an interest in saying that. I don't know what Heather would say. Yeah, obviously had a, and here's the thing, like, it was a failed marriage. Something very bad happened. There's reasons to, and that's what I think is so weird. Like, I look at Tom's relationship with Heather, and I'd say, however it ended was very bad, and one or both of them fucked up. Probably Tom, maybe Heather. We don't know. The stuff at the beginning, to me, I mean, there are some questions, but it's not obviously wrong to me. And I know people are gonna, and if you don't like it, if you want to say it's creepy, that's not something I would be into. Fair enough. Just like you, wouldn't expect somebody to become gay. It was another one of my friends was at Porkfest was saying, asking why I don't do drugs. Why don't you smoke weed? Just smoke weed once. Just try. Aren't you ever curious? Don't you want to know what it's like? And I was like, you ever wondered what it was like to suck a dick? He's like, no. I'm like, you want to try just to see what it's like? Maybe you'll like it. And he was like, and I was like, here, if you suck my cock, I'll smoke weed. And of course he didn't, right? He was not into it, right? And that's fine. But he wasn't going to say you're creepy and weird because you're gay, right? And if somebody, again, grooming, if you're going after somebody who just is a kid, has not gone through puberty, does not know and cannot understand abstract concepts, is physically so far beneath, then yes, grooming, horrible crime. What happened to this guy I knew on Grindr from his babysitter, horrible crime. And I've heard many other stories along those same lines. That's awful. And one of the things is, one of the reasons that kind of happens and people get away with this because we don't talk about it, right? We're not supposed to talk about it, so we just pretend like that never happens, and so there's not really an outlet for it. But if you're talking about a mid to late teen who's gone through puberty, who can physically have kids, and therefore mentally, evolutionarily speaking, probably has the wherewithal to rear them, they probably are not in the phase where they can get groomed, or that's a meaningful concept at that point. And maybe you don't like it, but you're going to have to do, if you're really going to condemn it as wrong ethically, I think that you have to have a very serious discussion about age of consent. And I know people are like, just even saying that, people have this reaction like you're just trying to enable predators. No, the laws are different all over the place as it is. They clearly could be reformed. And it's not clear that the reform would be we raise it to 18, right? Like, I mean, this is the people who are like, she was only 19 when she got married. So what is your argument that we should raise the age that you can get married to 19 or 20 or 25, right? Because your brain is not developed fully. And again, there's some validity to that idea that your brain is still plastic until you're 20, which is a good thing. It means you learn more faster. But you don't have to have your brain be fully mature to make every decision, okay? So, like, it's absolutely true that you gain experience and perspective with life, although a lot of people don't have the introspection to gain any kind of cognitive advantage with a couple extra years. But you don't have to be at your absolute peak to make every decision, right? Knowing whether you want to kiss somebody or talk to somebody online, I mean, a lot of guys, like every gay guy I know knew they were gay before they were 18, 19, right? Almost, not quite, but almost, and I remember one telling me that his parents caught him when he was pretty young on YouTube searching hot gay sex, and they punished him and it was a big deal. But, what happened as soon as he got old enough to get a phone? He got on Grindr. And what did he do as soon as he could? He started meeting guys. And eventually he became a full adult. And he's still completely gay, right? So, he knew way before, right? So, again, there's some details in the specifics of Tom's that we don't know. We don't know what those conversations were like when she was 15. we don't know how their relationship ended, which I think is probably where the real like tragedy is, where there's really something weird. It wouldn't surprise me if he just met a younger woman, right? That happens so often. And that seems to be his thing. The part that he's going to physically dominate her, I don't think that's true. I mean, again, if you've ever seen Tom Woods, he's not physically dominating, and he seems to like bigger, younger girls who could probably beat him up. Maybe that's what he's into, I guess. Again, that's not for me. It's not my thing, but I'm not going to say he's evil for that. But anyway, uh, because this is a topic I've talked about before, and because Tom is Tom, I thought I'd put it out. But so if you guys want to find the article, I think it's called "What Your Facebook Friends Are Wrong About Tom Woods." If you go onto Twitter, you just start searching it, you'll find lots of references to it. I don't like the fact that he's trying to hide what happened, because it does seem like he is. And I don't like, but I also don't like the fakertarians, having all these innuendos. Like she's only 19. Like, well, can she consent or not? If she can, then I'm sorry, maybe you don't like it. That's fine, but this is fine. And that same question could be asked, as a 16-year-old, like legally she could consent. Now, unless we're going to assume the laws are perfect, which is a silly thing for anyone to assume, let alone a libertarian, to assume that the laws are perfect. We should be able to ask the question at least, can a 15-year-old consent? And the answer might be no. I mean, we could always, like, I'm totally open. People are like, look, if you look, here's all the reasons. Okay, fine. Like, but you have to understand too, when the laws were created, they were not crafted in that way. This is probably too much to go into here, but it wasn't like they got a bunch of neurologists and pedagogues and pediatric surgeons and psychiatrists, and they said, we've determined that 16-year-olds can consent and 15-year-olds can't. There was a lot of, we want to control kids, we want to take them off the streets, we want to force them into school, we know what's best for them. There was a lot of progressive do-gooderism, from people like Jane Addams and a few others who looked at, like, this is a labor market that we want to regulate, that we want to abolish because it helps small businesses. In our zeitgeist, teenagers should not be out running businesses or doing their own thing. They should be forced to go to school because school is so important. And so we need to strip away all of their autonomy legally so that we can then coerce them to go to school or become wards of the state or wherever else. And part of that fell into losing their rights in terms of, like, all of their right, like all their personal autonomy, including their, which goes, the sex thing and dating thing is just a sliver. It's an important sliver, but a sliver of everything that, you're taking away when you say you can't consent, right? That you're a ward of the state or of your parents. So you should be able to ask the question. And I think it's very debatable when we're talking about 15-year-olds. I think it's not debatable when we're talking about 9-year-olds or 10-year-olds or 11-year-olds or 12-year-olds. And then when we start getting to 13 and 14, it starts to become a cohort issue where the answer to a small number of 13-year-olds is probably yes, and a large number of 13-year-olds is probably no. And then when you get to 14, it's like, still a lot of them it's no, but a lot of them it's yes. And when you get to 15, I don't even think it's 50-50 at that point. But, we could get into semantics, we could get into the debate, but to just say it's obviously wrong and he's obviously a groomer, I think that's completely unfair. So anyway, long one on this. Next one, we'll see. But thank you all for watching, and have a great day.